Okay, so we're starting with Chapter 3, Video 1, and again, if you haven't printed off the PowerPoints and the worksheet, then you want to go ahead and stop and get that material ready. In Chapter 3, we're talking about, generally speaking, what life is like in the colonies. We get a lot of general information about this, and then we'll be specific about the different colonies. So in the early years, we were dealing with colonists who were mostly male and young, the ones who were willing to go across the Atlantic, which was very dangerous to do, and settle in a new world. Some were indentured servants, and we'll talk about that. Some were slaves, and we'll talk about them as well. England also is going to periodically empty out their jails of convicted felons and send them over to the colonies. Now, that doesn't mean that they were necessarily violent criminals. A lot of times, if it were tough economic times, the debtors' prisons would fill up, and they would occasionally send those folks over here. And the estimates are around 50,000 altogether had been sent over here. And about a third of these folks are traveling with their families. And I gave you a slide also about the population growth in the colonies that you can just kind of look over. And you just get a sense of how rapidly we were growing. Of course, the numbers were small. If you consider in roughly 75 years, we went from 2,000 people to 75,000 settlers over here. That's a huge leap in a small amount of time. But we were starting with a pretty low number as well. It also bears noting that life was a little bit healthier here in the colonies than life was in England. The average age at marriage was 20 or 21. You have young people who were trying to get a little bit established and figure out how they were going to make a living before getting married. And there's some information about that in the History of Women in America book, too, if you choose that chapter. We had a higher birth rate here in the colonies than they did in England. And the death rate was lower here. And that's for a number of reasons, everything from better climate here to more food, more warmth. I tell my students sometimes that if you're cold and hungry, then it might be that you're lazy, because you can just go out back and shoot something, or you can go out back and cut a tree down and have firewood. We also were living a little bit more widely scattered, which meant then if people got ill, it didn't sweep through the community at quite the same rate that it might have in England. I gave you some information about women in the colonies, and of course colonial women had very few rights when you compare it with today. When you compare it with other times in our history, though, sometimes they came out a little bit better. They were expected to be meek, to obey and serve their husbands. They couldn't preach, they couldn't hold office, they couldn't vote, they couldn't sign a contract, they couldn't bring a lawsuit, they generally couldn't go to the schools that were available. But in the early colonial days, women were doing a lot of jobs that later are going to be considered the men's jobs, because there just weren't that many people here to cover all the work. We also see in a lot of colonial laws that there were laws on the books to protect women from certain levels of abuse and to give them rights to a divorce in certain circumstances. Now, I said that we would talk about indentured servants. Indentured servants are folks who would come over to the New World and work for a certain number of years, and that work would be to pay off the price of their ticket to the New World. There were good circumstances, good stories with this, and some not so good stories with this. Certainly, if you're in England and things aren't looking good for you there, for whatever reason, it was an opportunity for you to come to the New World and have a fresh start, even if you couldn't afford the ticket. You could go and make arrangements for the period of time you wanted to work based on how much money you needed and so on. Then you would come over here and work for that person. In the best circumstances, you would come and work and serve out your time, and when your time was up, as your indentured servitude was up, you would be given some land maybe or some tools. You would have been taught farming here, or perhaps you were an indentured servant to a silversmith. You would have learned that trade, and then you would go and start your own work after you had served out your servitude. Of course, not everybody had the best of circumstances. There are stories of children being kidnapped and sent over here as indentured servants for the money. Orphanages would sometimes send the older children over as indentured servants. didn't necessarily make it a bad deal for those orphans, but it wasn't of their choice usually. There would also be criminals who would escape this way, get out of England and come over here. There also are a lot of stories about people who had a set period of time for their servitude, but let's say they break a dish. Well, several months might be added to their time to pay off the cost of that dish, or if they broke a piece of farm equipment or anything like that, time could be added to their servitude, and it wasn't always done in a very fair way. They were not always treated very well. There also, beginning in 1619, the Dutch brought the first shipment of slaves over. There were about 20 Africans who were brought to Jamestown. In the early days of slavery, they were treated differently than the later days of slavery. There are a lot of slaves who in the early days were treated like indentured servants. They were kept for a certain period of time. They were taught a trade, and then when that time period was up, they were allowed to go and live on their own as free people. You can see a lot of stories where slaves might, at the end of the workday for their owner, they could go work for somebody else for wages and use those wages ultimately to buy their own freedom. Now, as we look at the different colonies, we'll start first with the New England colonies, which will be settled, as we talked about, by the Puritans. Now, farming was not going to be the way to make the money in that area, so they're going to do more shipbuilding, fishing, whaling, and so forth, using the ports out of New England. They also will be participants in what's called the Triangle Trade, where you have ships leaving New England, taking rum to Africa, selling the rum and buying slaves, bringing the slaves back across the lower Atlantic, or I guess the mid-Atlantic, on what was called the Middle Passage, taking them to the islands of the West Indies, and then getting products like molasses, some other things out of the West Indies and taking that up to New England and creating that triangle trade there. In New England, you also hear stories about witchcraft and the Salem witch trials. There's a lot that can be talked about with this, so you might want to look at some other videos or some other information in your textbook or whatever, wherever you want to look for that. But there was an incident in 1692 where a number of a number of witches supposedly, were accused of having practiced witchcraft. Now, this is kind of a big flare-up of this, but there had been a number of women accused of witchcraft before this, and who had been hanged for witchcraft before this, but there was a flare-up in Salem during this time period, and you can read about how that came about, where at that time period, roughly 19 people were hanged for witchcraft. When you look at the ethnic breakdown in the colonies, though, in New England, as we said, it was pretty much going to be made up of the British Puritans who had come over to settle for religious purposes. The southern colonies were you had less immigrant groups, less different ethnic groups there. You had slavery developing at a greater rate there, and then you had some white people here, but there wasn't as much of an ethnic mix as you might find, for example, in the middle colonies. The middle colonies, or the middle Atlantic, is where you found the greatest diversity. You found the greatest diversity in ethnic groups, coming from a variety of places. You found the greatest diversity in professions, in the cities, and so forth in the middle Atlantic colonies, and we'll talk more about that.